Right now, every CEO and board wants the same thing. Show me how AI can change our business. And under that pressure, a lot of companies are mistaking motion for progress. Pilots, consultants, and tools that don't move the needle. My guest today challenges the status quo. His name is David Hyman, co-founder and board advisor at Lendi Group, the company behind Australia's largest online mortgage platform. In this conversation, we cut through the hype and get practical. How Lendi deployed a customer-ready AI agent in just 16 weeks. Why so many AI projects never make it past a proof of concept. What happens to skills, culture, and trust when agents start doing the work? And where the next decade of opportunity actually lives, even if big tech owns a stack. Quick favour before we start. If you've been enjoying the Moonshot podcast, please hit subscribe and leave a review. It helps more than you think, and it's how I keep bringing on amazing guests like David. I'm your host, Tatiana Pandurovic. Let's dive in. Dave, thank you for joining the Moonshot podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here as an AI pioneer in Australia.
Oh, it's very kind of you. No, it's great to be here. Looking forward to the chat.
So let's just get into first Lendi. So you're the founder of Lendi, digital home loans, a disruptor in the market. You then merged with Aussie Home Loans, which is an iconic but fairly traditional legacy organisation in Australia. How did you go about merging those two cultures from two very different organisations?
Yeah, it was a really interesting process because when you're sort of going through a merger process, there's a whole bunch of steps you go through. And the first few steps are actually kind of theoretical. You go through, what we call the industrial logic. Does it make sense? Why should we bring these two businesses together? And maybe starting there before I sort of talk about how we did it, because I think it's important context. So Lendi was the original and the leading digital home loan platform in Australia. So we built it in 2013. We came to market in 2013 and then obviously built the business from there. And that was really about how do you build a great digital experience in a space where everything was pretty much offline and manual. And Lendi really pioneered a whole bunch of different things, everything from digital ID to digital docs to integrating directly with banks and kind of bringing that together in one platform. On the other hand, Aussie was this great trusted household brand. So everyone would remember John Simon and, being on as kids on TV, I'm sure you remember it yourself as well, and brought competition to the banks and built a great brand, great distribution network. And obviously the business was sold to CBA at one point, and that was all happening at the same time as the digitization of everything. And the opportunity that we saw was really, great brand, great distribution, big customer base, big broker base. How do you bring those two things together and take the best out of both worlds? So that was really the on-paper strategy. There's obviously a lot more behind that. When we came to bring the two businesses together, you basically had a somewhat scrappy but enterprise-grade digital home loan business that was fundamentally a product and technology organization. And then you had a enterprise-grade 30-year-old business built around a very charismatic founder with a lot of, there were people in the Aussie business that had been there for 30 years. There were people in the Aussie business where they were previously in the Wizard business that Aussie had acquired from Mark Burris. So there was a whole bunch of, and I say this in a positive way, like a positive legacy in there. And really what we had to do was bridge that gap and take everyone, so brokers, team members, and I don't just mean the Aussie brokers and team members, but also the Lendi one, on a journey to say, actually, we've got to leave behind what was Lendi and what was Aussie before. And we actually created the Lendi Group. And that meant different things to different people. So for our team members, that was about, okay, what is this new size of organization? Now that we've got these great capabilities, what can we turn this into? And then for our brokers and customers, it was also how can we leverage that to create the best broker proposition? How can we leverage that to create the best customer proposition? And that's kind of now culminated in what we call our find, buy, and own strategy, which is everything from a customer value prop to a broker value prop. And that brings property search, conveyancing, buyer's agent, mortgages, and the whole ownership cycle into one platform supported by a team of experts. And that's been a lot of fun. It was probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do professionally. And when I say I'm in the team, there was 1,000 brokers doing things 1,000 different ways. So the change management around that was actually people-based versus technology-based. And I think, obviously we're here to talk about AI. There's a lot of parallels in a sense that, the technology can be great. It can be the next best thing, but actually the hardest part is changing the way people work and people's mindsets and people's ambition. So there's a lot of parallels there.
No, it's really incredible because, I mean, anyone that's been through a merger or an acquisition just knows how difficult it can be. And to exactly the example that you shared, the technology, the operating model, and the systems, despite that needing a lot of integration, that still typically ends up being the easier part. But the people component is still quite difficult. So you mentioned there you had to bring in standardization and consistencies across a very large network and also merge two cultures together. It's really hard to do that. Is there any examples you've got of how you merged the culture of the business to what vision that you had and what the way that you wanted to operate?
I'll give a couple of examples, but maybe start with principles. So the principles that we used, in particular through the Aussie process, were really centered around the concept of consulting to start with. So we didn't have all the answers, and we were quite open about, hey, here's what's worked in the Lendi business. Let us understand more about what's worked in the Aussie business, and let's come up with a joint view around what that looks like. So that was probably the first principle. And then the second principle was all around the concept of opt-in and pilot groups. So we then started by saying, here's a view based on what we think best practice of A and B looks like. Let's make it opt-in to start with. And we use those opt-in processes to better understand exactly what works, what doesn't. We made it win-win-win in every case. And then once we had enough momentum and there was really clear data around something being a better state, and oftentimes it wasn't the first thing we started with, it had iterated many times, we were then able to move to a state of, okay, great, for these things, this is just the way we do things now. And it was really that consultation, opt-in, and then basically high conviction execution mode that really worked quite well. It wasn't without its challenges. Whenever you're changing things, people have, they wake up in the morning and they have a job that they do and they know what that looks like and they've got expectations around what their day looks like. People, and I don't mean brokers, I just mean people in general, don't really like change. It's not natural. But I think once you go through this process and you help people understand the benefit of change and it becomes more of a constant, that muscle in a business is really important, because then it doesn't become this high friction thing that you have to do once every 6 months or 12 months. If it's happening every week or every month or every fortnight or whatever that is, and people get used to it, that's actually a really good muscle for businesses to have.
I can imagine that you also had to lead through a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty because there's not a lot of playbooks on how to do this really, really well. What was that like for you as a leader? And did you have reflections and learnings just going through that entire process?
Yeah, I was really lucky to have a great leadership team, and there was a few people that had been either involved in businesses that had either acquired other businesses or done integrations. But we all came to it with kind of like a big level of humility, and we all acknowledged that this was not something we'd done before. But what we had done was we'd built businesses from the ground up. We'd rolled out new products. We'd rolled out things that didn't exist before. And so we had frameworks that worked in terms of saying, how do we go from A to B, and how do we do that in a way that is not high risk so you can sort of test and iterate along the way? And we looked at all of those things. We looked at the problem that was in front of us, and we just applied those frameworks in a way that we didn't sort of come in to profess and say, hey, we've got all the answers. And we're quite open with our people about it and said, look, here's the vision around where we're going. We don't quite know what getting from A to B looks like, but here's the framework we're going to use. Here's the approach we're going to use. And I think when you take people on a journey like that, it becomes a high trust exercise. And if you get it wrong, you're really clear around why you got it wrong and you pivot really quickly.
Yeah, there is a lot of humility in actually being able to say we don't know that this will work out or that this is the right way, but we have this vision and this is how we want to try get there and iterate on the way. It's a really nice leeway into agentic AI and what you've been able to achieve. Last year, it was the biggest buzzword of the year, certainly across most organizations. And for our listeners who are hearing about the concept for the first time, it's really giving AI the capability to be able to execute workflows autonomously, which is a very different paradigm to any other technology that we've had in history. And most organizations have been trying. They've been piloting, they've been doing POCs. There's research from Accenture that about 80% aren't seeing those pilots go to production though. You managed to build and deploy a customer-facing Agentic AI system in 16 weeks. Can you go through the process of how did you actually make that happen?
Yeah, so that was the culmination of years of going on this AI journey to start with. So, it's really important to kind of set the context here. So Lendi's been building with either machine learning or AI for a number of years, but really we started our AI journey in the context of this new generation of generative, now agentic AI, back in 2023. So when ChatGPT, or when OpenAI released ChatGPT, like a bunch of us had OpenAI Playground accounts before that, but when ChatGPT came out, that was kind of the watershed moment for a lot of business, like as it was for a lot of businesses. We started off by running a hackathon across the whole business, and that really, even though the tech wasn't there, and either hallucinations, cost, speed, whatever the thing was, it wasn't there for a bunch of reasons. The hackathon we ran in 2023 was a really good eye-opener around use cases. So we basically said the objective to the business is you basically have to form teams. This was like cross-functional. It was brokers, it was team members, it was people from legal, it was engineers, it was everyone. And your task is basically to reimagine a part of our business using AI. That was the only constraint. That surfaced a whole bunch of different use cases and ideas. And almost all of those are now in production as agents. A lot of them were in production in 2023. Before agents were really a thing, or before agentic was really a thing. And that really gave us the early momentum to then move to the second phase, where we had a really cohesive AI strategy that had 3 tiers to it. One around, the base platform and infrastructure and architecture, one around kind of enablement and proliferating AI through the business, and then one around 10x ideas that would sort of leapfrog us in different parts of the business. That again created additional momentum. And really it was an external factor that kind of was probably the input to this 16-week process, which was the reasoning models coming out, and specifically when O3 came out, which I think was the end of ChatGPT O3, which was I think the end of 2024. And this was the first time where cost, capability, and speed all converged. And all of a sudden, use cases that were not possible became possible overnight. So we had a whole bunch of things that we had built conceptually, but just the models weren't good enough yet. And then all of a sudden, model changes and these use cases can come to life. So everything from and a lot of these were around complex document processing. And that effectively gave us the conviction to say, we're now in this phase where the technology could actually stop from a development perspective and we could fundamentally change our whole business. So we got a group together, and really what we were doing up until then was we were not necessarily bolting AI just onto our existing processes, but we were thinking about different parts of our workflow or different objectives we had as a business and inserting AI. So that might have been, customers call us after hours, and in the past they used to leave voicemails. We now have AI voice agents for that thing. Or customers chat with us on web. It used to be people answering that. We now have first line, which is AI that gives us 24/7 coverage, and it then triages to people so they can have high quality conversations. What we did in our process in 2025, which we called Project Aurora, the whole objective there was, imagine you're starting the business from scratch. The only constraints we gave the team was don't break the law. So whatever resources they wanted, whatever team members they wanted, whatever APIs, internal APIs they wanted to use, everything was on the table. We even said, if you need anything prioritized within the business, we'll do everything we can to prioritize it for you. But fundamentally kept them completely ring-fenced from a dependency perspective. And their objective was rebuild the business with AI at its core. So don't try and make that thing a bit better, actually reimagine what it could be if you've got AI tools.
And who was part of that team?
So this was probably the interesting bit. Me and my chief product officer actually delegated almost all of our day-to-day roles. So we're a big business. So this was a really reasonably big deal at the time, and to other members in the team. And we effectively ring-fenced the Aurora team, and we were embedded in that team full-time, effectively. We also learned a lot about in-person versus remote in this experience. So we were one of the businesses that during COVID really embraced remote. COVID was obviously pre-AI. You could do certain tasks sync or async as we talk about them internally. And that was kind of okay with remote work because you'd sort of, your role in a particular process or a particular function might have meant you can just, ship something off to someone else and wait, 10 days for that design to come back or for that document to be reviewed or whatever that is.
How do you define sync and async?
So sync is really anything that we're doing now. We're having a sync conversation right now. It's happening in real time. Async is when you sort of want to kick something out because it's going to happen in the background. It can be running in parallel. So that might be in the old world pre-AI. That could have been a product manager has written a product requirements doc and 2 or 3 engineers need to go and build the components of that over a week or 2 weeks or whatever that might be. And, there might be some check-in points along the way, but largely the deliverable is going to happen in the future. In a world of AI, the requirements happen in a room. You're recording that session. The transcript from that recording is fed into an agent. The agent knows what you're building, transcribes that into a PID, which then goes into a prototyping tool. And in half an hour, you've got a fully clickable prototype. There is no async anymore in a lot of cases with AI. And so what we found through Project Aurora was actually having everyone in the same location 5 and oftentimes 6 days a week and oftentimes out of hours, because this was a very intense process, really meant that we could get things happening quickly. Again, not at a sustainable rate, but it was some really, really interesting learnings.
And how big was this team? So it was you, your product manager.
Yeah, it was really small to start with, actually. So when we kicked it off, we knew we wanted to have a cross-functional team. So we pulled in people from our contact center. We pulled in our GM of risk and compliance. Obviously, we had product managers, we had engineers, we had data engineers. We worked very closely with all of our partners, like the hyperscalers, like the Amazons of the world and the Databricks of the world, to bring it to life. So they had people embedded in the team, but it was really 10 or 15 people through this core period. And really the objective of this team was to kind of reimagine things. And we used a vertical slice approach. So we didn't try and solve every bit of complexity on day one, but what we really wanted to do intentionally was touch every single business domain. So everything from how do we create ads agentically to how do we work out our customer segment to how do we test product propositions, all the way through to the actual product, the software development life cycle, how customers come into the process, how we generate insights, how we underwrite, how we recommend products, everything all the way through to even getting that loan across to a bank. All of that had to have a level of agentification, as we sort of call it. We've used a couple of different approaches around human on the loop and human in the loop quite intentionally. We're obviously in a regulated space. The vast majority of the process is human on the loop. So basically product managers watching what the agents are doing, getting involved where guardrails are getting hit or evals are failing, and only really having a human in the loop at very specific stage gates where we might need to from a compliance perspective or just a risk perspective. But largely speaking, the outcomes of that process where we delivered the first agentic home loan experience in Australia late last year. So went live kind of October, November time. We've been optimizing for about 3 months. And the team have had some amazing results. I mean, if you think about customer satisfaction scores, coverage from a time perspective, and ultimately unit economics, they're all incredibly positive, because you sort of move from a world where a lot of the busy work that was being done by people before, now the people are actually doing the high value tasks. And so, if someone's just kicking the tires or wants to see, what the scenario could look like, they can do that at, 1 a.m. if they like on the app. and really get the value that they're looking for. And it's where they need to turn that into an actual home loan that they get access to the trust and the human connection that our brokers bring.
No, it's really remarkable, and I don't want to at all underplay what an achievement it is. I've worked in AI across Australian enterprises for the past 18 months, and there is very few organizations that have managed to get customer-facing agentic AI solutions out to market. It's extraordinary. When you did your rollout, was it to a pilot group of end customers that you were then comparing your old process versus the new process to kind of evaluate how you were performing? Is that
Yeah, it's a
approach?
good question. I'll talk about the approach more broadly. So we've got two brands. We've got Lendi and we've got Aussie. Lendi is like our pure play digital brand, and then Aussie is our broker-led digital supported brand, is the best way to think about the two. We built this in the Lendi brand, but it all runs on the same tech stack. So what we've been able to do there is basically we went live to a slice of Lendi customers, which on day one, as you can imagine, was a very, very small number of customers, very, very intentionally. As the team's been refining the way the agent speaks to the customers, the tools that it calls, the way that it drives, it's actually an agentic user experience. And so there's not a deterministic flow around what it does and what it does next. The agent can actually decide, and it can pull up different components. It might ask one customer to upload their driver's license and make it really easy for them to do it that way. Another customer, it might only do that at the end of the process. It depends on the scenario. But the team's basically been optimizing the not just the prompts, but also all of the different components in there. So how many agents there are, how those agents delegate between each other, speed, accuracy, etc. And then what we've been doing is we've got through our project Aurora is we're expanding within the Lendi brand breadth in terms of more segments. So every week and fortnight, they're bringing more and more segments in. And then in addition to that, all of the things that are working, whether that's a interaction pattern or a specific piece of technology, there's a team internally now. So the Aurora super group, which is now a cross-functional kind of squad, is now over 50 people. They're like our internal AI enablement squad. We're not building it centrally. They're just enabling the rest of the business. They're then taking things that are happening in the Lendi brand and then shipping it across to Aussie. So we've launched a whole bunch of different AI agents now to Aussie brokers and Aussie customers that are all powered by this technology. So it's a way where we've sort of been able to kind of internally build this vertical slice end to end and then take the learnings and apply it to our slightly different business models.
It's a really incredible journey that you've taken, and there's a few things that stand out to me from the very early story where you talked about hackathons with bringing cross-functional teams together. It's really simple, but I've just seen how effective it is when you start to bring all these different roles across the business together to actually be part of. And I know in the early days it was probably more about enablement, but it's quite empowering to do that all the way through to having a really small, dedicated team to work on a problem. Some of the most successful implementations I've seen have been really small teams. It's been leadership, it's been having risk, compliance, and security there very early in the process. And something else that's quite unique to me is that you look to, rather than bolt on AI, but completely redesign a process of your business really without any constraints. If you look at kind of some of those success factors and your learnings, you're a digital native organization. What about organizations that are large, like enterprises or public sector organizations? Would those same principles apply, or do you think that they might need to take a slightly different approach?
Look, I think the bigger the organization is and the more it moves into, with respect, like it's got a level of bureaucracy around it, the harder it's going to be. However, the fundamental shift that's happened with AI, and I have lots of conversations with board members, C-suite, and just, technology leaders in a lot of these organizations. The only time I've seen organizations succeed with AI in the last couple of years has been when they actually think about things completely differently. So the approach around how you build and how you go through governance will definitely be different. So a big bank is going to have a very different risk appetite and a risk management framework to Lendi, for example, if we're just looking at someone in the same sector, but the customer opportunities and the customer problems actually don't change, and what AI enables doesn't change. And so if you then separate how do you solve the problem from how do you then govern and do change management, the problem solving actually is quite aligned. It's really the governance and the change management that's going to be slightly different for some of those bigger organizations or organizations with a higher level of either regulatory scrutiny or public perception or expectation. But I think, fundamentally the thing that holds true in every conversation I'm having is because the technology shift is so large and the capability shift is so large, no matter who you are, you have to rethink everything.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest challenges that I hear when I talk to leaders is around how to assess impact in that early phase of potentially getting a return on investment when it comes to agentic or just any AI solution. Lots of leaders are looking to cut costs, generate revenue, improve efficiencies, but measuring ROI with AI is different to how they've previously done this. How do you think about assessing ROI when you're looking at early ideas to determine where you'll actually apply resources?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the million or billion dollar question, depending on how big your business is. And I'd say the answer to it is there is no one way of doing it. What I can share is some of the different ways we're starting to think about things. And if you, maybe just as a bit of context, if you go back pre-AI, the cost of building was really, really high. So you had a certain set of resources and you had a backlog, and the backlog was often 5x the resources. And so the constraint was really, what do you do? And from a prioritization perspective, and therefore there was a lot of scrutiny around what you built, what was the ROI, because the trade-off or the cost of doing the wrong thing was you had all these other things that just sat on the shelf, so to speak. If you go to the complete other side of the spectrum and look at where we are with AI, and this is a generalization, but for new features, the marginal cost of development is getting pretty close. It's trending towards zero. For forward-leading organizations that have an agentic product development lifecycle or software development lifecycle, you can often go from idea to production-ready feature in a matter of days, if not weeks. We've shifted from a 3-month cycle down to days and weeks, depending on how complex the features are. And that's only trending further down as, not just products like Claude Code and their equivalent, but also models like Opus 4.5 and some of the new coding models. Obviously, ChatGPT 5.3 is rumored to be coming out soon and apparently is well ahead on the benchmarks from Opus 4.5. So we're going to continue to see this models pushing the boundaries, tools pushing the boundaries. And what that then means from a prioritization perspective is it's actually no longer the constraint capacity. The constraint is quality. And so while there is I'm going to say a natural friction for large organizations in particular between POCs and production, which is much more of a risk thing than a building thing. So if I just put that to the side for a second, if you move to larger organizations, or if you just put that to the side, you're in a world where because the marginal cost is so low, you've got to come up with a framework that says the things that I'm building are actually going to ladder up to something. Now, it doesn't make sense to take a little thing that takes 2 or 3 days and do a business case around it. It's actually, it's ludicrous. And I think the people that are trying to use those frameworks, they're going to spend a lot of time spinning wheels. You've actually got to start to think about things in a multidimensional framework. So one of those frameworks that I really like is the VIC framework. So V being velocity. So how does this improve our velocity? And that could be speed to decision. It could be cycle time from step A to step B. There's a whole bunch of different velocity points. I'll come back to that in a sec. How does it improve our intelligence? So is this putting the correct information in the hands of our leaders and managers more than it was yesterday? So if you go pre-AI, the way leaders and managers used to get data was a report gets emailed to them, or they're going into reports on a dashboard somewhere and looking backwards to see what happened and making their own decisions on what they should do in the future. AI actually takes and abstracts a lot of that stuff away and, can say, hey, Tad, it's Monday. Here are the 5 most important things for you to do. And here's actually how to go and do them. And the best businesses are actually, the agent actually says, hey, I've done steps 1 to 3 and you just need to do 4 and 5. And then the other aspect is capacity. So how does this particular product feature, use case, whatever it is, increase capacity? And that's really where P&L impact sits. That might mean, you had an operational team that had an output of 100 and now it's got an output of 300 as an example. The approach we've taken there on capacity is this is just leverage for us to grow. You put all those 3 things together, and largely it comes down to the previous conversation we're having around, the mindset around where AI can go. And I was actually having this conversation with the team earlier today. It actually requires you to say, not what are the use cases I'm building, what's the ROI, but what's the vision for this part of the business? And so whether that's a customer-facing product like Guardian or whether it's the finance function, what does AI native finance look like? What does that mean for the CFO? What does that mean for the business partnering team? What does that mean for all the executives in the business? And then working backwards from that, okay, here are the 15 or 20 building blocks to get there. And you can definitely build a business case either using an ROI framework or the Vic framework or another one around AI native finance as an example.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And it's still quite, I still find it quite a big challenge in terms of prioritization when you go to bigger and bigger enterprise, because I think the inflection points to how far away teams are away from the vision of the business is greater. So that gap is greater. So it's almost like being able to redefine that for different functional business units and then work through the entire workflow of what needs to happen to achieve that. I want to ask you about Australia in general as a market. We were talking earlier, I know you've been to San Francisco recently. Currently, about 90% of global AI funding is going to the US. The EU is very focused on regulations. Australia typically falls somewhere in the middle. We tend to be a fast follower, but the recent RBA data suggests that we are still quite risk averse. What's your general view around Australia and how Australian organizations are approaching innovation when it comes to AI?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different speeds happening. So there's how are businesses and enterprises adopting AI as a general theme, and then there's where are the AI startups and where's the funding going. And I think, as you just said, unequivocally, the US and in particular San Francisco is like the beating heart of AI. We were talking before. You land at San Francisco Airport and you drive to downtown San Francisco, and without any level of exaggeration, every single billboard is an AI company, and it's like AI for finance, it's AI for risk, it's like AI compliance.
AI for your fridge.
No, there is a Samsung ad that is like an AI toaster, I think, or AI on your fridge. It's actually almost a running joke, and so it is genuinely the beating heart of AI. You go and sit at any of the blue bottle cafes where a lot of people will be working on their laptop and people are having a meeting about their startup, talking about their new AI startup or whatever it is. So that's like a theme, and that's genuinely different from what we're seeing here in Australia. On the enterprise and business readiness side, I think most markets around the world are following a pretty similar pattern, which is the framework I like to use for that is it's a spectrum, as like anything, especially when you're going through change. On one side of the spectrum, I think you've got the AI curious organizations. Now, they might have rolled out Copilot or Gemini or ChatGPT, whatever. But largely speaking, they're giving people a chatbot to interface with, and maybe they're connecting some tools and stuff. That's not going to move the needle. You've then got AI adjacent organizations, and there's a lot of businesses that have gone hard at investing, and they've got lots of either POCs or even production agents, but they're fundamentally doing things still the way they used to. And then you've got the AI native organizations. And largely speaking, the AI native organizations were conceived in the last 3 years. Most of them had a founding date of 2023 and earlier, and more recently. There's only a few businesses globally that have actually made the leap and you can genuinely say they are AI native, and they're a bit like older businesses. This is like the Shopifys of the world, the Klarnas of the world. We've obviously put a stake in the ground and said that's the pathway we're going from a Lendi Group perspective. And it's obviously a hard pathway to go on, but I think, if you look around the world, whether it's Europe, whether it's the US, or whether it's Australia, that's probably the part of the market. That shift from AI curious to AI adjacent is one big leap, and it's a spectrum. And then the shift from AI adjacent to AI native again is much harder, and we're seeing far fewer companies make that leap.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the innovator's dilemma. It's an entire reinvention, which is, I think, what you were trying to do really with Project Aurora. We went through an entire generation of workers who've been having to do a lot of grunt work to develop instinct and have really good leadership skills when it comes to making decisions throughout their careers. We're now in a world, if AI handles and automates most of processes, if you've got a 22-year-old grad starting at Lendi, how will they ever develop the scars they need to lead in the world that we're heading into in the future?
Oh, they're just different scars. I think if you look at the difference in the AI revolution is it's happening so quickly and it's such a big capability jump. But if we look back, and whether it was when the Industrial Revolution happened and we moved to manufacturing, or whether it was the automation of manufacturing, if you just use cars maybe as a really crude example, that used to be handcrafted from the tires up genuinely, and you've now got a level of, first phase of automation was, machines guiding those steps, and then you had automation at different levels and people assembling the final product, and now you've got almost fully autonomous factories. Really the analogy around that is humans moving to be more on the loop versus in the loop, or actually doing the work themselves. So if you're thinking about that from a grad perspective, it's really about people thinking at different levels of abstraction. And what I mean by that is, if before, and I'll use like the legal fraternity as an example. So if before you had a junior lawyer coming in and, they're doing their 50, 100-hour weeks in their first couple of years, and a lot of it is grunt work. Let's say they're in M&A and they're doing, due diligence reviews and reading documents. The way that work looks now, or will look in the future from an AI native perspective, is they will be orchestrating agents who are then doing those deep dive reviews on documents and interpreting the outputs. There's a flow-on question from that to say, do you need as many of those lawyers? And that question is still yet to be answered. And, are those people displaced into other roles that are yet to be conceived, or is it a net loss? But the actual work itself just becomes abstracted one layer higher. And so what that really means is people need to think more in systems. They need to think more abstract. But again, I hear a lot of people, and there was in the early days of AI, this argument that AI makes you less smart. I would posit the opposite and say that it's actually the most amazing on-tap intelligence in your pocket, on your desktop, on whatever your device is. And if you've got a curious mind, your ability to learn new skills or sit yourself across multiple business domain areas or domain areas is just unparalleled if you look backwards at history. And that's really an exciting thing for, people, whether you're at school thinking about what you're going to do next, or you're just joining the workforce. It just means you've got more leverage. And you can sit across more things.
Yeah, just as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the most important skills as we get into, we spoke about it earlier, a world where change is going to happen faster than it ever has before. And I think it was Stephen Bartlett who posted about the two really most important skills that will be required moving into the future. And one was the ability to learn and be curious, kind of coupled together. And two was adaptability, which goes back as far as humanity's really ever existed. And when you look at the kind of the youngest generation now that's growing up, they're going to become accustomed to change. So as we move into an AI native world and the technology continues to disrupt the world, they might actually be the most adapt and ready to that change. That's probably a little more difficult for anyone that's existed pre-2023 and hasn't necessarily need to adapt to that.
Completely agree. I mean, it's just, the key difference this time is it's happening really, really quickly, and it's such a big capability jump. But once we go through this change window, to your point, the people that are at the coalface or the people that are going through that change, the kids of today, as they come through, they're going to have a completely different skill set to any of us. So it's exciting.
It is really exciting. On what you said around skills and is AI making people dumber, there's a really interesting study from MIT that they did very quickly after the initial adoption of ChatGPT, which was to try assess the impact of people that are using AI, and they did this study on students. So they gave one group of students the ability to use AI tools, and the other group were not allowed to use AI tools when they wrote an essay. And they measured a few things, but their findings following this experiment was the students that were using AI, their essays were far more similar than students that weren't using AI tools. They also found that they had less memory retention and recollection of their own essays. They also felt less authorship of their own work. And they also reconnected with the students 2 to 3 weeks after, and they found that this persisted. And so that brings like a few really interesting things to the foray, which is we just spoke about new skills needing to be developed. But I've also found that there is certain skills like deep thinking and creative work that we'll probably need to be more deliberate around, because they're the kinds of things that we can very quickly get used to taking shortcuts. And so actually being deliberate about focus in certain areas, I think will be important as well.
Yeah, I think the big flaw in that MIT study is they used a new tool, but they assessed it against the old way of learning. And the point you're making, I completely agree with. Because the tools changed, the way of learning needs to change, and the skills that people need to have need to change so that we can get the leverage out of it on the other side. I think it's not directly relevant to this, but there's a quote from Dom Price. I'm not sure where he got it from.
He was on my show last week.
Oh, was he? There you go. I think, and maybe he might have even quoted this on your show. I'm not sure I've seen the show yet, but he said at our AI event last year that a fool with a tool is still a fool. And I think what it talks to there is really, if you've got high agency people using these new tools, they're always going to get the leverage. What we need to work on as a society level is how do we give everyone else, and I'm not calling everyone else fools, by the way, but how do we give everyone else the skills and the capabilities that they need to learn differently and do work differently in the world of AI? And my view very, very strongly is the output at the other side is people with high cognition, better quality output, and ultimately more agency because they've got less breakpoints and dependencies and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Another question that I wanted to ask you was around this shift we're seeing around vertical integration. And I saw a post you did on LinkedIn recently, and you used XAI as a prime example that they're buying the entire vertical ecosystem to run their business, from the power, the chips, and the data. If these massive tech organizations are locking up the entire stack, what opportunities going to be left for other businesses?
Look, it's a challenge, right? We've had, I'm going to say, almost 2 decades now of concentration around big tech. So the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons, the typical, like the FANG stocks, basically. And with AI, there's an extra level of complexity. And what we've sort of seen play out over the last couple of years is it's really interesting actually watching the like competitive landscape play out, right? So you had Musk's previous involvement with OpenAI. You got Google DeepMind writing the Transformer paper in the early days, and they clearly knew what was coming, but didn't want to cannibalize their own business. And so they were a fast follower, and arguably the Gemini product is one of the best in market. But really what's really interesting is you've got OpenAI and Anthropic effectively having to buy and rent infra, so below the foundation models, whether you're looking at chips, power, everything, like they're having to kind of build that infrastructure. You've got Google with the full stack, and they've obviously got the TPU advantage, and now Musk with XAI. And, you sort of said he's, buying up the stack. He's even building part of the stack that doesn't exist yet, which is still theoretical, which is the power in, power via satellites.
Yeah, he's got the satellites, he's got the robots that he's...
Well, he's obviously, with SpaceX built reusable rockets that kind of, if you look at the marginal cost there, like that's a exponential curve down. There is a theoretical pathway to get data centers into space, which they're working on. And obviously from like the power problem gets solved if they can make that work from an engineering perspective. And really what that tells you is there's effectively an arms race going on. You got people like Eric Schmidt coming out of retirement, so to speak, to come back into the game because the opportunity is so large. I think what it really means, and again, you can play this beyond the concentration around some of these big companies. You play that out to like a geopolitical level. There's really this big race towards whether it's AGI or ASI, and he who wins kind of controls the rest of it. And that's kind of what's playing out, I think, at a geopolitical level as well. And that's probably the more interesting story, but that's probably a whole podcast episode in itself.
I think so, but you just touched upon something that's really interesting, which is the big energy problem or energy constraint. All of these massive data centers require energy, and we've seen instances where the energy grid is starting to face a lot of pressure. We can't just create new energy, which is why all these organizations are looking for alternate sources of energy. They're looking at potentially going out into space, as you said. How does that energy constraint, which is going to be very real and is only going to increase in the next couple of years, actually going to potentially stifle AI innovation? Like, how do you see that playing out over the next few years?
Oh, look, I'm probably a maximalist on this in a world where I've sort of, if you watch any major opportunity, necessity becomes kind of the driver of outcomes, I think. And so you look at what's happening with Musk in space, you look at what's happening with Eric Schmidt, you look at what's happening with some of the other, basically, whether you want to call them startups, or you just look at the traditional, the public-private partnerships between, say, the US government and, bringing on nuclear power in a whole bunch of different places, requisitioning land to do so, the same thing happening in other sovereign nations. I think the power thing will get solved. It's just a matter of, does it happen in a straight line or is it a bit lumpy? As, clearly these are not 6-month and 12-month CapEx projects. They're 5 and 10-year CapEx projects. And that's probably the biggest challenge. It's where does it happen on the time scale? How does that play out practically? I mean, practically that plays out just in the cost of compute because it's going to restrict supply if we don't get there in a straight line. That, to my mind, is only ever going to be a short-term problem because all of that capacity is coming online in the background and there's new and novel engineering approaches being taken, like the data centers in space one. Again, not solved yet, but obviously a lot of money getting thrown behind it, that I think will happen over this next sort of 5 to 10 year window.
Yeah, the world's going to be a really interesting place over the next decade, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's all changing pretty quickly.
As we wrap up, I want to do a speed round. And so the way that this works is I'm going to share a word or a phrase with you, and all you've got to say is overrated or underrated and one sentence why.
Okay.
Ready to go?
Got it.
All right, first one. The one-person unicorn.
Underrated. AI leverage means that what you need to do to build a business, if you've got a high agency, high capacity, high capability person, we haven't seen it yet, but I think we'll see it in the next few years.
The MBA degree.
Overrated.
Why is that?
I think you can learn much more on the job.
Sovereign AI.
Underrated. Because we've got all this data, way more data now going into inference, and all the previous controls around data sovereignty. A lot of people have taken the shackles off.
Smart glasses.
Underrated. Because I think that wearable technology that brings the outside world into our world is going to be incredibly important in the world of AI.
It's kind of like you said with Project Aurora. It's a completely new interface for new technology. And last one, Agentic AI.
Underrated. I think that people still underestimate what it's going to be when we shift from human motion to agentic motion and what that's going to unlock in every facet of a business. Everyone's still just looking at it through the front door of how does it impact their consumer-facing product, not all the way they run their business.
And last question to wrap up. This is past the speed round. I thought you did a brilliant job with those. They were very different. You've said we're entering a world where the friction to launch a new idea is effectively dropping to zero, changing the definition of future organizations and current organizations completely. If you were starting fresh today with all these new tools and technology capability that's available, what is one specific problem or industry that you would be most excited to build a business around?
It's a very good question. Your listeners probably know that I handed the CEO reins in our business over to my co-founder, Sebastian, in December. And let's just say there's an AI theme, but watch this space over the next couple of months.
Okay. No preview today, but we'll be watching out for whatever you're doing, Dave. Thank you so much for joining the podcast and sharing all your insights. What you've done is truly extraordinary when it comes to innovation, and I'm very excited to see what you're building next.
Thanks. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.